Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge country. We'd like to acknowledge the land we meet on today as the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with the country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So thanks very much for coming along. We're really happy to have a guest, a colleague from Flinders University, Professor Lambert Schuwirth, and he's speaking about something that's very, well, I think is going to become increasingly important to everybody, and that's a programmatic approach to education in general. And today he's going to talk to us about programmatic assessment as a response to disruptive changes in education. So I'll hand over to Professor Lambert Schuwirth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Can you all hear me? Don't have to shift up the mic. Okay. The other thing is I'm from the Netherlands, so if my Dunglish gets in the way of you understanding what I'm trying to say, please slow me down. A couple of disclaimers. Firstly, I come from medicine. I'm an MD by training. I'm not an educationalist, nor a statistician or psychologist. So my examples are from medicine. And what I'm telling you about today is from what we're doing in medical education. And I hope there is some overlap or some transfer to your field of research and education. The other thing is I'm happy to make my slides available. They're not my knowledge. They're based on the literature, so they're based on the knowledge of many other people. So I don't own them. You are happy to use them. You can even pass them on as your own if you want to, but I would ask you not to change them and then put my name to it. That would be. So what I will do in roughly 40 minutes is I'll provide you a quick overview of what programmatic assessment is, why, so what changes are we facing, at least in medical education or in higher education and in medical education, or some things that are on our radar. Then some of the limitations that we see in our current approach to assessment, what I've nicknamed the testing approach, and then what programmatic assessment is, a bit more in depth and with a quick summary, and hopefully time for questions, discussion, disagreement, whatever. We Dutch, we thrive on disagreement, so that's good. So quickly, as an overview of programmatic assessment, here are the things. Programmatic assessment is a way of assessing using multiple instruments. Well, that's not new, but it's continual and longitudinal. So it's not based on a final assessment or a barrier or exam, but it's a continuous collection of information and decision making. It has a focus on meaningful triangulation, and I'll explain what I mean with that further on. And it focuses very much on proportionality of decision making. So we never make high stakes decisions on small data sets. We always use large data sets when we have to make high stakes decisions. And therefore, it has to employ a diversity of quality approaches, which goes far beyond the traditional psychometric approach to quality of assessment. And that's how we try to remain integrative and holistic. So we try not to pull medical competence apart in little testable units, but we try to keep it integrated. First, some changes. I mean, what you see is all the headlines about we don't know what higher education is going to be, and there's disruptive changes, and all these scary headlines. But there are some things that we're seeing happening now. And of course, the most logical one is artificial intelligence. One of the core abilities, core competencies that we teach our medical students is to make a diagnosis. But to make a diagnosis is a simple diagnostic or categorization task. And if we know one thing is that artificial intelligence is becoming ever better at making these categorization tasks and making these diagnostic decisions. So that's not going to be the core of the future medical or the healthcare professional. And what you already see in medicine is there is a shift, certainly from a patient perspective, from asking for cure to asking for care. And our medical training is still very much focused on delivering cure and very little focused on delivering care. The other thing is that, and everybody calls Wikipedia a change. I see Wikipedia as a symptom of a change of the fundamentally different view that we have on what constitutes knowledge. In the old days, when I studied medicine, knowledge was something that the expert had and that he or she would give to the non-expert, either for a fee in education or for free, when you're helping each other. Nowadays, we see knowledge as something which is co-constructed, which is constantly contributed to by the different perspectives. And of course, Wikipedia has had a major impact on the encyclopedia industry, and they've gone bust. And all these disruptive changes are having impact on industries. Everybody knows Uber taxi industry and Airbnb and eBay and online vendors having an industry having an impact on the retail, etc. The next one is what we see is a different management of transactions, of the trust in transactions. So if I buy a house and you sell me a house, there's never a moment where you hand over the key and the property papers and I give you $800,000. So we go through conveyancer, and the conveyancer manages the transaction and manages the trust, much like universities manage the transaction of education and through accreditation manage the trust. But increasingly we see that the management of trust is being disconnected from the management of the transaction. And in the peer economy, so Uber is not a taxi industry. Uber is a hitchhiking taxi industry. It manages the trust of hitchhiking for a fee, whereas taxi industries bundle transportation and management of trust. The next one, and it's one that I find most interesting, is cognitive surplus. So a couple of weeks ago, my wife sent me a text and said, do you know how to change the battery in an electronic key for the car? I said, I had no idea. Yeah, it says battery low. So I came home and there was her key on the table, sorted out. So I went online and there's somebody, even without any words, just showing how to change a battery in an electronic key for an Isuzu MUX. That person doesn't know me, doesn't know that I have a question, yet that person is helping me. And that cognitive surplus creates a lot of information, accessible knowledge and skills and abilities in the internet, which is accessible and which decreases expertise asymmetry, whether it's between the doctor and the patient. Sometimes the patient may know more about their disease now than the doctor, but also between the learner and the teacher. And we're not good in education still at managing that decrease of expertise. Open ledger systems, blockchain and stuff, we were gradually developing ways of having automatically authenticated ledger systems or information systems, whereas we as universities are still relying on producing a piece of paper with some numbers and some signs and signatures and some pixie dust saying that you're now competent, whereas open ledgers and related procedures or related processes could actually allow a future employer to interrogate the whole learning journey rather than relying on a piece of paper. So that has made the question, led to the question whether the current university business model is still tenable. And Ernst & Young, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, a couple of Watt reports in our field, the Woods Review, they're all questioning whether higher education is a business model that's tenable for the future, sustainable in the future. What you typically find is that if the big consulting firms put out these reports and self-commission these reports, they're seeking new grants. It's like Dettol saying, you have to be scared of germs that you can't see, but they're there, and we've got a solution for it. It's the same thing. You have to be scared for the business model, but we've got a solution for the future. The thing is, they will muscle themselves into this field. So let's focus on medical education. One of the things that has changed is that there is a point of care information availability. And we have to remember that the lecture, and the word lecture derives from lego, past participle of lego, I have read, it was actually an educational innovation developed for people who didn't have books. Because the only way of transmitting knowledge was the reader, the lecturer who had the books, reading to the people who didn't have the affordance of the book. So that was 500–600 years ago. So if we as universities still use, or as higher education still use the lecture as the backbone of our curriculum, we're using a backbone which was developed for people who didn't have books to people who have access to everything here and now. And even when I studied medicine in the 1980s at Maastricht University, problem-based learning university, quite innovative, self-directed learning, and what have you, it was still the university that controlled the affordances for my learning. They decided what models in the anatomy practical rooms, what books in the library, what readers, what readings in the syllabi, etc. Nowadays, students control the affordances. They will look. And you know all the stories about students having their own Facebook groups, etc. Am I still in? Yeah, I'm still in Skype. And having their own platforms for exchange of knowledge and for collaborative learning, completely outside of what we offer. We've got a different view on what constitutes a safe and independent doctor. So even when I studied medicine, there was the idea that when I graduated, I would have been equipped with all the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and problem-solving ability that would last me for the rest of my career. Of course, I needed to update my knowledge and do some CME, but I was not expected to learn anymore. That's the reason why we think that final examinations work. Because a final examination is basically a final test to see whether you're ready for the rest of your career. But nowadays, we expect our doctors to continue to learn because these disruptive changes are happening. So we expect our doctors to be continuous learners and to be self-assessors and self-regulators and to continue. And that creates a big problem because traditionally, hello, Mr. Johnson, how are you?
Sorry, I'm late.
We noticed that. So the traditional view worked because the span of control ends with graduation and our responsibility to society starts with graduation. So if you operate under the assumption that you are being equipped with everything you need for the rest of your life, and we've got a final examination, bless you, final examination, we can actually assume that during our span of control, we can assume responsibility for the rest. But if we now operate under the assumption that people have to be lifelong learners and self-developers, that control responsibility doesn't work very well. And a final examination is not going to manage that. I already said there is a shift from cure to care. So medicine has been, certainly when I studied it, it was seen as a technical discipline and an ever more technical discipline. But what we're seeing, and certainly in the medical education literature, that medicine is increasingly be seen as a humanistic discipline. Our literature is, if you compare the ratio of papers about how to teach anatomy to papers about how to develop professional behavior, communication, collaboration, professional identity, is 1 to 500 probably. We've done that, the technical skills. We're really focusing on the humanistic skills at the moment. So there is an attention to these soft skills, which makes it far more difficult to test in a standard type of assessment as we're using. Probably the most difficult one, the biggest culture shift, is that we need to shift agency for the assessment to the learner. What we typically do is we allow our students to self-direct their learning, to self-regulate their learning. We expect them to do, but when it comes to assessment, we take all the control. It's not a good idea. We take all the control. So we keep on testing and controlling the assessment for our students, and then when we graduate them, we say, and now you're on your own. It's like wiping the bum of your kid until they're 21 and say, now go and live on your own. We never allow the students to take agency over their own assessment. Whereas when they graduate, we expect them to be able to do that. And they've never been allowed to practice that. Medicine is riddled with scandals about bullying, burnout, suicide, etc. So we don't empower our students to deal with difficult, unpredictable, uncertain, sometimes toxic environments, unfortunately. So what we're trying to do is to move from that reductionist measurement to a more comprehensive one, a more integrated one. So even when I studied medicine, this was the typical view on medical competence. Medical competence had a component knowledge, a component skills, a component problem-solving ability, and a component attitudes. And for each of these, a test should be developed. And if you look at the literature pre-mid-1990s in medical education, it was all comparative designs. It was all open-ended questions better than multiple-choice questions, written tests better than oral tests, etc. If I translate that to medicine, it's like NSAIDs better than antibiotics. It depends on the disease. So the question has shifted to what does each type of assessment contribute to understanding competence, rather than is A better than B. If you look at the competency frameworks in medicine, and there are zillions around, and I'm sure that your domain has competency frameworks as well, but the medical competency frameworks, if you look, all the top ones are medical expert, medical knowledge, and good clinical care. The more cognitive, the more technical skills, and then the rest is all about what we would call the soft skills. So apparently in the competency frameworks, it's already realized that medicine is a humanistic care discipline and not a purely technical cure discipline. And what we also notice is that students do not learn when they don't get, or optimally, when they don't get good feedback. And the score is not really rich feedback. And you need meaningful results and feedback in order to steer your learning. And I mean, the work by Erickson and his whole group shows that constant, useful, constructive feedback with the opportunities to improve and to learn and to evaluate creates higher levels of expertise, more efficiently, more longer lasting, etc., than a simple selection test throughout the whole career. So why programmatic assessment? Well, let's look at what we're currently doing with testing. And with testing, we make some strange assumptions, at least assumptions that do not fit our findings. The first one is that what we're measuring, this knowledge, skills, attitudes, and problem solving, can be treated as generic personality traits. So we assume, like intelligence, we assume that you've got a certain amount of intelligence and you can do stupid things or very clever things, but the intelligence is assumed to be, at least during the moment of measurement, to be generic. So we assume that one test at one point in time measuring knowledge is indicative for a stable trait of knowledge. And it's derived from the original test psychology, it's derived from personality testing, etc. That notion that personality traits are things that we were born with and that we retain for the rest of our lives. I think there's a lot to be said about this. So in a theoretical situation, if I have a test with 4 items and 5 students, and here are the results, students A through E, and if I were to be able to give those students a so-called parallel test, an equally difficult test on the same topic, but with slightly different items, we would assume that it's reproducible. We would assume that student A would still be the top student, or even stronger, would still score a 4. What we're actually finding is a lot of scatter. If I would take these matrices and I would partial out the variance components, what I would find actually is that there is more variance associated with interaction and general error than there is signal. So if I were to express this as a signal to noise ratio, there's much more noise than signal in the system. Which doesn't mean that real life is messy because it won't adapt to our model. It means that our model is not very apt in explaining what happens in the real life. And I always say that if I fly back, if I am somewhere and I'm flying back, I wouldn't want my pilot to come from such a matrix. So the second one, in order to do that, we have to treat all individual items as meaningless. If you take a personality test like an MMPI with 560 items or what have you, or each individual item is meaningless. They only become meaningless if they contribute to a total score. And I can see how, for example, in a test on medicine, somebody who answers this item correctly and answers this one incorrectly gets 0.5, and somebody who answers this incorrectly and this correctly gets 0.5 as well. I can live with it. But if we have skills tests where people have to perform different patient-based skills and somebody completely screws up a resuscitation but is very good at communicating, I wouldn't say on average you did okay. So I've got two children. If they're both sick and I go to a pediatrician and it's a major failure in one of my children and the pediatrician performs better than average in my next child, I wouldn't say, oh, on average that wasn't too bad. Yet that's what we're constantly doing in assessment. And it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. And if we go back to meaningful feedback, if it doesn't make sense, it can't produce meaningful feedback. So therefore, that means that we only infer validity, what the test measures, from the total scores. And we don't care about how these total scores have been collected and collated and combined. As one of my colleagues used to put it, it's dodgy math and poor stats. You can't average everything, and I use this slide mostly to illustrate the ludicrousy of university rankings, by the way. It's called reification. We reifify a phenomenon by putting a number to it, and then we believe that the number represents the truth, rather than understanding that the number is just a description of what we're trying to capture. So all our statistics have to be based on elimination of information. So if these are the responses to 3 open-ended questions, and the red ones are the incorrect ones and the green one is the correct one, we now know what type of mistakes the student made. And I can give feedback on those mistakes, and the student can learn from their mistakes. But what I'm doing is I'm going to score them, put them into a number. So when I score, I only know to which item an incorrect answer was given, not what particular incorrect answer was given. When I add them up, I only know to how many items an incorrect answer was given. I don't know to which items an incorrect answer was given. And then I dichotomize it into a pass-fail, and now I've lost all the information, except the only thing left to me is, were there sufficient correct answers, yes or no, based on some arbitrary norm. So the whole literature on standard setting is basically literature on how to throw away measurement information in the most elegant way. Whereas I don't think you need to. And I already said there is the assumption that there is one single best instrument for each trait. And in medicine, we've moved away from that. In the early 1900s, it was assumed that there was one best way to solve all diseases, like atropa belladonna was seen as the panacea, the solution to all problems. And in medical education, unfortunately, that thinking is still prevalent. We're still trying to find the silver bullet, both in assessment and in education. So what programmatic assessment tries to do is to counteract this by using multiple instruments with a meaningful triangulation. And what I mean with meaningful triangulation is, here are a couple of instruments that we use in medicine, and we all like to look at competence. But what we typically do is we take a score for the DOPS, for the OSETs, for the OSCEs, for the VIVAs, and what have you. Every instrument needs to have an acronym to take that. And then we add up scores. In programmatic assessment, we actually would have all these instruments and go across the instruments. Take a bit of the mini-CX, a bit of the essays, a bit of the OSETs, and see how that triangulates in the narrative to tell me something about your role as communicator or as health advocate. And that's when people, at least people in medicine, start to raise their finger and say, oh, that's impossible. We cannot add information from various sources. So I always have the same exercise and say, well, let's start with a patient enters your consulting room. complaining about thirst and fatigue and frequent urination. On visual inspection, you see poorly healing wounds. If you palpate the peripheral arteries, you feel low or absent peripheral pulsations. Oh, by the way, the glucose is 32 millimoles per liter. That adds up to, and everybody says, diabetes mellitus, which is logical, but you've just combined verbal, visual, tactile, and numerical information. We can do that. We do it all the time. Every healthcare provider combines, in our daily lives, we combine information from various qualities and various sources. And the reason why we can is because we've been trained to. We've been trained to make sense of information from various sources. And the problem is that we've never been trained to be good assessors. The assessment of literacy is something that is not always taught or trained, at least not at my university. So if we were to train our assessors to make those judgments, they would make better judgments and they would make it much faster. Yeah, we're good for time. I was a sort of learning coach, as it's called in programmatic assessment at Maastricht University. And initially reading a portfolio took half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. But when I got to know my students, eventually it only took 10 minutes because I knew exactly where to look for what. Expertise is always associated with efficiency. Which means that we want to continually collect. The traditional thing, the traditional testing program that I see is you've got your course, you've got your test, there's a decision, yes, no. If the decision is yes, you go on to the next course or module with the next test. If the decision is no, we retest. If the decision is again no, you probably have to redo the course. And in the end, we're stuck with a couple of binary data points. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then we make arbitrary decisions about this counts for 30%. It's never 28.743% because we don't like 28.743%. There's nothing sacred about round numbers. And then we have to make a decision about 5 out of 7 have to be satisfactory, etc. But we struggle to reconstitute that rich image of competence because we've thrown away all the information along the ride. So what we try to do in programmatic assessment is actually collect as much information as we can. And what I've learned from you guys is that we've only been thinking about a human person collecting that information. We've never thought about what learning analytics could contribute to that. But bringing all that information together from an LA perspective and from a human judgment perspective would give you an enormously rich picture on competence development. And it allows proportional decision making. So if I've got little information, I can only make, and I will only make low stakes decisions, intermediate stakes decisions, or high stakes decisions only on rich information. And that proportionality is incredibly important because it never allows a student to say, I failed this test on 1% or on one item only, because there is never one item. It's been a continuous process. And the student who fails at the end, that will never be a surprise to him or her, because they've already been warned and they've already seen it coming, because there's a trajectory rather than a one-off measurement, which requires a diversity of quality approaches. So if I order a hemoglobin level, I'm not interested in the lab analyst's opinion. I'm only interested in a number, and that number has credibility to me because I know it's replicable. If I take the same homogenized vial of homogenized blood, and I redo the test, I should again find 5.8. And the interpretation of that number is based on population data, standard errors of measurement, 95% confidence intervals, and what have you. And that's good enough for me. But if I order a pathology report, I want a narrative. I don't want a number. And I am interested in the pathologist's opinion. And the credibility doesn't come from population data. The credibility comes from that pathologist's training, the clarity, coherence, and plausibility of their report, and the way it addresses my question, and how it triangulates with my other information. So it's a different way And we're not using those views on quality and quality assurance in assessment. So what we typically do is we focus on reliability. And reliability is, in the classical test theory, focused on test and parallel test. And it's either an influence whether the same scores, so would John, again, score 58% on a parallel test, or the same position in the rank ordering. If John is the third best score on the original test, would he be, again, the third best scoring student on the parallel test, or at least should the same students pass or fail? But there are different ways of looking whether we've got this universe generalization, whether we've observed enough. For example, in qualitative research, we use saturation of information. So if this is my sample, I would assume that the universe is yellow. Oh, I'm seeing new colors. I'm seeing green, blue, red, and yellow. Oh, I say orange, etc. I continue my sampling. And again, I'm seeing new perspectives on competence. Again, I'm seeing radically new insights, purple and black. But I continue sampling and I don't gain any new insights. Doesn't mean that they all have to agree. I'm seeing the whole picture. And competence is increasingly seen as something which is best approached from a complexity perspective, which is multifaceted and has multiple perspectives. So the whole idea that you can capture it in one number is actually quite silly. You can build in credibility and reliability, and this is more aligned to the way healthcare delivery works. You can actually build quality in your organization. So what typically happens in programmatic assessment is that students are trained in self-regulating, reflecting, maintaining a portfolio, what it means to develop competence, how to monitor their own learning. And staff are trained in how to evaluate a portfolio, what's good enough, what's not good enough, what are the warning signs, what are the early symptoms of lack of competence or discompetence, etc. And there are regular meetings between the student and the staff member in which the student sets learning goals and actually has to enact those learning goals. And then at the end of the year, the coach or the mentor or the supervisor makes a recommendation, and the student is invited to give their view. And you wouldn't believe it, but I had at least 4 or 5 students in Maastricht where my recommendation was, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and recommend satisfactory. And the student said, I'd rather want you to give me an unsatisfactory. And the first time I was puzzled. I said, why? And they said, well, I've got summer holidays coming up. If I get a satisfactory, I won't do anything, and I won't get any support. If you give me an unsatisfactory, I will get support, and I have an incentive to actually remediate it to catch up because I know I'm struggling. And that's what you actually want. Because some research, and specifically Maxine Papadakis' research, shows that students who get by the skin of their teeth all the time run into problems later on. And to explain it to my colleagues in medicine, I say, well, that leniency bias of failure to fail, covering up is like suturing a contaminated wound. And every clinician says, you don't do that. Because if you suture a contaminated wound, underneath the festering goes on. And it becomes an osteomyelitis. So what you do is there is an issue, you open it up. That's what we try to do. So if student and coach agree and there is some marginal check on the process, you don't have to do anything, final decision. If they disagree, you might want to have a more thorough check. And if it doesn't lead to sufficient agreement, you might have another thorough check. And only in the 2 or 3% where you're still in doubt, a full committee looks at it. By now, you must say, whoa, this is very expensive. And it is. So we modeled it in Maastricht, which is a different higher ed sphere, but we modeled it, preventing 2 cases of attrition of study delay paid for the whole system. And I don't know how costly attrition is here at your university. I don't know how costly it is to have a student who has to redo the year. The Netherlands has output financing systems. Therefore, it's very costly. Every student who has to redo the year costs the university at least 40,000 euros. Every student who attrits costs 40 to 80,000 euros. So it's very easy to simply pay for this system out of the prevention. And like in medicine, prevention is always cheaper than cure. Well, not always, mostly. That way we can have an integrated focus with a meaningful triangulation. And that's important because we want to gradually give the agency and the empowerment to our students to take control of their own assessment. Small example, if a student in the Netherlands at Maastricht does very poorly on one of the assessments, it needs to feature in their portfolio, of course, and then they have to come up with a plan for remediation. They have to organize their own remediation, and then they have to come up with a credible way of demonstrating to us that they've remediated. We never organize resits. Why would we? We didn't create the problem. Why? Typically, students create a problem, and we have the problem because we have to organize resits of subs. In an adult situation, people solve their own problems. So self-regulation doesn't mean I'll do as I please. Self-regulation means I take in control, but I also take accountability for the assessment. So this is the cycle I already said. You've got the whole document, which is constantly being populated with new information. Student writes a self-reflection. I prefer the word analysis, just analyzes what goes well and what doesn't go well. Has meetings with the coach. Coach is not a nice person. Coach is actually somebody who kicks your bum. It's like a sports coach or a musical coach. They try to get the best out of you. So they're not interested whether John is better than Jim. They're only interested what does John need to do to be optimally better tomorrow than today. And working with, students who are able to cognitively master medicine. I studied medicine. It's a study for the idiots under the academics. It's not rocket science. It's not theoretical physics. Medicine is easy. It's just a lot. So students who come into medicine are able to cognitively master studying medicine. The thing is how to get the best out of them. Now, final slide, final two slides. So if we look at competence, and we take one of these, the CANMAS as a competency framework, we look at the role of communicator, collaborator, manager, medical expert, and what have you. So instead of taking it apart, we look at the same way we use perspectives on chronic diseases. So I used to work in pain management, chronic benign low back pain. I can look at it from a socioeconomic, from a nociceptive, from a psychological, from an occupational therapy point of view, from an orthopedic point of view. And it's never either one or the other. What I do with my patients, I constantly see where the best way forward is. What's the best perspective? What's the best angle of attack to improve the situation? Not to cure the pain, to improve your situation. And it's the same what we try to do in programmatic assessment with competence. We're constantly looking at where is it most effective to put your study effort, your learning effort, your development effort in to become a well-rounded, competent doctor. So in summary, it's only one piece of the pie. It's not the solution to all the problems I talked about at the beginning. The world is changing, medical education is changing. Our testing approach is not wrong, but it's really insufficient at the moment, and we need much more. Programmatic assessment would be one of the promising avenues to go. It's not a silver bullet, but whatever you do, there has to be more focus on feedback and assessment for learning, and a focus on giving the students agency and control of their own learning, but also of their own assessment. If you get the slides, here is some background reading. That's why I wouldn't claim that this is all my knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lambert. That was very interesting, and I enjoyed your medical metaphors. There's very fertile ground for making your point. That's very good. So if there are any questions in the room, I'm ready to take them now. And if you could wait until you've got the microphone, because we are recording this and there are people online. So any questions at this stage? There's one.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. You touched briefly on the costs associated with it, and it sounds brilliant because the feedback, the ongoing support, the contact, building that bigger picture is fantastic. But as you mentioned, the world is changing. We are scaling up students and not necessarily staff at the same time. And so I'm curious how, if you have any thoughts about how maybe parts of this could be integrated in without having to go the full way in, especially as a way to sell it to the people keeping the books. If we've got some runs on the board, then we can maybe expand. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and you're right. Cost is an issue, and cost is an issue because we see the overt cost, but we don't see the hidden costs. So in making the fiscal argument, getting the overt cost and the covert costs on the table is very important. Upscaling, there is an ideological argument and a realistic argument. The ideological argument, okay, we're getting more students but not more staff. Well, that's just scrap management. Sorry. I mean, it's like Mercedes saying, oh, we're now producing poorer quality cars because, hey, we need to cut costs. Nobody will buy the cars. And in my introduction, I say, well, your biggest competitor is not Adelaide Uni, nor Flinders, nor Melbourne Monash. Your biggest competitors are students who say, I can't be bothered having an academic study. I've got PhD students, PhDs on admin roles. So why would you invest in a PhD? Certainly not in a discourse where we say that higher education is, the discourse in Australia is higher education is only an individual investment by a student in future employability and high salary. Well, if that future employability and high salary doesn't produce a return on investment, students will vote with their feet. That's one thing. The second thing is, I was in Singapore 3 weeks ago, and one of the leaders of one of the medical schools said, yeah, look at our curriculum, this is what we're doing. We've got first-rate education. By the way, you in Australia got second-rate higher education. Bang, on the table. I thought, come on, you must be kidding. No, you haven't invested in higher education in years, and it shows. You got bad higher education. That's where we draw our international students from. So the argument ideologically doesn't make sense, at least not from a business. Daimler-Benz in 2016 had a turnover of 153 billion euros. They reinvested 7.52 billion euros in R&D of car quality. Not in infrastructure, not in machinery, just research and development of what quality of driving in cars means. That's 5.5% of that turnover. I looked at on the Flinders website and I looked at the annual report. It wasn't even a line item. That's 80% of your income is generated through education. Education makes a profit, research generates 20% income and makes a loss. Hit rates with the ARC and NH and MRC are 10%. Do you think that Mercedes would ever dream of producing 10 cars and throw out 9 and still call themselves a business? So we have to recognize where our income is. Our income is through education. So a university that doesn't want to invest in R&D of education will quickly run out of business. And I predict that the first universities will start falling over in 5 to 10 years. The magical 5 to 10 years, but very soon. There is also a rational argument. And the rational argument is that it's not the issue of cost. It's the issue of finding sufficient staff. Because not all staff are born to be good learning coaches. And sometimes it's extremely difficult to get them motivated and to get them trained to be good learning coaches. So upscaling, if you're working on a small scale, it works because you can handpick. And there are always a couple of good things, good ones. And if you only need 5, easy. If you need 50, you struggle. So the thing we found most difficult at Flinders is the change of culture. So I come from a culture where university education is seen as a societal need. Government invests heavily in higher education, even with scholarships, etc. And it's seen as a need for a society to have a sufficient critical mass of critical thinkers to maintain a healthy democracy. That is the viewpoint. So students don't have a personal, get me across the line so I can start earning money, not that big drive as some students, at least at Flinders, have. Just cut the crap, get me across the line, get me my registration so I can start earning money. And fair enough, that's the context in which they have to work. So getting them to reflect, which is already a nasty word, but to analyze and to formulate learning goals and to demonstrate to them that that actually makes them a better doctor and makes them better employable is something that we're struggling with. Yep.
Thanks. We've got a question from Brooke online. Does coach imply the same academic who works with a student as they move through the program?
It's hi Brooke, by the way. It is it's something we're not sure about, but generally we would say yes, a coach remains with the student for the duration of the whole study, which means that the coach has to be somebody who knows the more basic sciencey stuff and the clinical sciencey stuff enough to be a coach. That's one model. If I had it my way, you would have a very full-on coach in year one. You would have a more remote coach in year two. You would have to build your own community of practice in year three with a coach, and you would have to build your own communities of practice with a coach who's on call in year four.
Okay, she has a follow-up question.
Yeah.
If so, which I think you're saying yes, I'd love to hear the model used which allows the process to work outside the silos of semester clumped subjects. Yeah. But she acknowledges in parentheses, yeah, we don't have all that.
You have to build longitudinal lines in your curriculum. And the managerial approach to education, the cookie cutter approach, like nicely confined modules or topics or whatever, blocks or whatever you want to call them, which are nicely ended by a test, doesn't work for something which is longitudinal. And many curriculums or curricula in medicine already have more longitudinal lines, but actually it should be one professional development.
Okay, thanks. Are there any more questions in the room? Anyone at all? There's one over here.
Thanks for that. I was really interested in the way you pointed out the assumptions of tests and the kind of point data. But I guess the other benefit of some of that stuff is that students who are in a problematic relationship with an academic can also move on from that and find a better relationship, or they can have a blip on their radar and move on. And I'm just wondering how much of that longitudinal information is then accessible by employers or interpreted by people, and how do you protect their kind of right to stuff up, I guess, across their journey?
Those are really important questions, and they pertain to the culture as well. The good thing is that there is never a moment in time where one examiner or one supervisor, one staff member can make or break the progress of a student, which also adds to the proportionality. It assumes that you've got an assertive type of student. So when I studied, during my medical training, I did my surgery rotation, and one of my female fellow students was asked a couple of anatomy questions during an operation, and she didn't know the answer, so she was belittled by the surgeon, and she said, "Listen up, mate, if I knew what you knew, I would be standing at your side of the table earning your shitload of money, but instead I'm actually paying you to teach me, so why don't you do your job and teach me?" That's a bit of a different type of assertiveness, and I told you the Dutch thrive on conflict, so well, I love that. But it certainly assumes that your student is willing to give feedback to the supervisor and the staff member as well. And it has to be a two-way street. If the student, and of course there are rules that if a student and a staff member really are completely incompatible and it doesn't work, there is not sufficient chemistry, either the staff member or the student can put in a request for change of coach. And of course, that's what football clubs do all the time. If the chemistry doesn't work anymore, you change your manager, your coach. The view on handing over the portfolio, again, it's a cultural thing. The dominant discourse in the Netherlands is a continuity of care document. The dominant discourse here is a criminal record. So, because if you want to learn, the best thing is to say, I really did poorly in my communication last year, and I got a lot of feedback that I really want to improve that. And a good coach with you would focus on how to improve. That's a continuity of care. But and that's why the coach is not the person who passes or fails you. The coach gives an advice, and the advice is, if the student agrees, okay, apparently we've got agreement, and there is some marginal check to prevent that there is no horse trading. But there is a firewall between the committee decision and the coach. So the coach gives an advice, adds information, but it's a committee, independent of the coach, that reviews the stuff and makes a final decision. So you need to build in those fail-safes. What these fail-safes are, what these safety nets are, is very dependent on your organizational culture. What I see what I find very interesting to see in the exam board meeting at Flinders is that the discourse has changed from, is it fair to fail the student, to is it fair to let the student muddle through? And I think that's more a care perspective.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll ask you to put your hands together and thank Professor Schuwirth. Thank you very much indeed, and the recording should be available a bit later. And Professor Schuwirth has kindly said you can see his slides, so we'll send those around a bit later too. So thanks very much, and thanks everyone online, and we'll see you next time.